Real privilege to have Joe Robertson joining us via Zoom from a very tidy hotel room this morning. Hello, Joe. Good morning.
Hi, it's good to realize that I actually could have tidied that bed and didn't. What I want this to resonate with people is like I'm just a really normal person.
Yeah, but you're a busy person, and you are in a hotel because you're out of Auckland into Wellington, and you've got some big meetings. You're very busy, Joe. But you're busy because you know a lot of things around therapy, research, education. You're the right person to be talking to about Relationship Corner. You've been a therapist for 14 years. My question for you, first of all, before we get into what we need to talk about, are you still learning about yourself and your own relationship after 14 years of telling other people how they should be doing their relationships?
Well, my husband Dave would like to think that I'm still learning, yes, but I think that there's this phenomenon in relationships where it's what you call learning each other's language. And I reckon it takes a good 10 years to learn the other person's language, and obviously not the words that they speak, but the way that they think, and also the way that they kind of are. Like the other day, Dave did this little smirk with his face, and I was like, I know exactly what that means now. Like I know that facial expression is so minor and I know what it is. And I guess I am still learning, but there's so much after we've been together 15 years that you do figure out, and you're like, okay, I know what's happening.
Sure.
Yeah, your husband Dave must be pretty comfortable with being used as the example for a lot of things, because you've got quite a high profile, like you're involved in a lot of things. And I imagine sometimes your own relationship is the go-to place to draw from when you're speaking about different things. So shout outs to Dave for being...
Yeah, shot, Dave.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He's happy to do that.
Hey, so we're talking this morning about expecting change in your partner. Like, is it in relationships? Is it acceptable to expect your partner to change for you?
Absolutely. I actually think it's a really strange concept to think that we wouldn't change for each other. That just doesn't even make sense. Of course, we adapt to the people that we're with and we accommodate for their needs, for their fears, for their concerns, anxieties, for the way that they were raised, and then the way that, we behave that impacts their childhood wounds. That's using real therapy language there.
Yeah.
But I've often, you see on reality TV and various other kinds of platforms, people talk about not changing your partner, or you can't change me. And that's just not even logical. Like, of course you change, and as you should.
What about though people going into a relationship or in the earlier stages where they're like, this is a bit of a I don't know if red flag's the right idea, but there's this thing about this person I don't know, but they're like, but don't worry, I'll sort that out. Or they'll change on that pretty quick. And then later on when they realize that a lot of people are pretty immune to change and sort of remain who they kind of are at their core, is that kind of a problem when people are going into something hoping they're going to see change and it'll be all right when that happens, but then it never does,
Yes, I think if you're going to commit to someone, you need to commit to who they are now,
Yep.
not to who you hope that they will be.
Mm.
However, the greatest sign of success in a relationship is where each person turns up willing to change. So where they turn up and they go, I'm adaptable and I'll work with you. That for me is the greatest green flag that I can see. However, if you're going to, get married to someone, for example, get engaged, you can't do that under the hope of what it will be like in 10 years. You've got to do that under the commitment that they may be this way forever.
So where do you start? What's the starting point then for relationships? Like, let's just say you use the words adapt and accommodate, and they sound easy enough to do, but you got to start somewhere to make that happen, right? And I guess it comes down to communication on both ends, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the greatest things you can do in a relationship is get to know each other's childhood. And the reason that you do that is because every time you're in a conflict, every time you're in a fight, every time you're in stress, every time you get anxious, you'll usually come out of your own child. So we all revert to a childlike state to some extent. And next time you're in a conflict, I want you to think like, how old do I feel right now? And honestly, most people will go back to a certain age, and it's usually between 8 and 12. And you think, like, what were the needs of that child at that time and how were they not being met? And that's what you'll be reacting to, is where you feel, abandoned, where you feel not prioritized, where you feel rejected, where you feel like, you were left out in the cold, so to speak, and other people were more important than you. So the best thing that you can do is get to know what it was like to be them as a kid.
Yeah. Let's just say asking somebody to change or adapting or accommodating somebody's behavior or who they are is fine. But let's just say there's a little bit of conflict and resistance, when you and I think for most relationships there may be that little bit of resistance, and then which ends up being conflict, right? Which ends up being maybe a little argument. Resolution in all that, like people tend to sort of like be filled with emotion, and sometimes they say certain things that maybe get taken out of context. So I guess what I'm sort of trying to get at is a practical tip for people who are plugging in right now. If there's no like meeting it halfway at the moment, what's your practical tip for somebody who's listening right now about where to go before conflict arises?
I mean, you can see signs of somebody not being willing to change really early on in relationships. And honestly, if you see that consistently, then that's not a great relationship for you. So if someone is consistently saying to you, like, I'm not going to change that, or this is just who I am, on minor things, not on big things, like you shouldn't be compromising on your values, for example. But then that's a really sign of an unhealthy kind of toxic person who's not willing to compromise. But before you get to conflict point, you want to be talking early and often. Dave and I used to do this thing, again, throwing Dave under the bus. Now this is a praise. But we used to do this thing where we would meet intentionally every week and we would go out for coffee and we would talk about our relationship and we would talk about what was going well and what wasn't. And that was brutal. It's kind of like a performance review.
Yeah.
When in your most anxious place. But what it meant is that created this culture in our relationship where it was okay to feedback, but it was also okay to change, like to take on the feedback. And we did it every week for 2 years, and it radically transformed the way that we communicated with each other. So it's what are the things that you could do early and often?
Nice.
How do you recommend people bring that up if they've and if you've been in a relationship with a long time with somebody and there's something that you're like, we need to see change in this area or in your area, if you're bringing it up for the other person. How do you kind of approach that without it seeming like an ultimatum?
Yeah, I mean, putting it in I language, and this is really important, is, why is it that you want it to change? Because it's not just that it will be annoying. There'll be something else that's happening for you that it's prompting. So, I'm really struggling with this, and I think it's because I feel when it happens. So even though for someone else this might be totally fine and like the behavior in and of itself might be okay, but for me it brings up this other stuff. So I'm wondering if we could shift it. And this is where I cannot like emphasize enough the tone that you use with your partner will just completely transform your conversations.
Is that tone acceptable via a text?
I'm not a big fan of the old text conflict.
Say now for Bjorn.
I don't text anyone. And yeah, what kind of, when you're having these conversations, you said you went out with your husband, you go out for coffee. The environment in which you have maybe more difficult conversations or you talk about things in a more serious manner, is that important too? Like where you have them or the timing of when you have them?
Yeah, definitely not after 9 p.m.
Nice.
Yeah, good call.
Last
nothing like no one's their best self after 9 o'clock. Well, some people are. They're really like in a zone, but there'll always be one person in the relationship who feels like they're dying.
Yeah.
And that's not fair on them.
You've given us some really practical tips, and thank you for that. But the last one from me, we could go on and on, Joe. You've been great. There's an article that I read where you say, listen like you mean it. So what does that look like practically?
Gosh, that's such a good quote. Thank you for that.
Wow, I am so wise. Thanks for bringing that up.
Listen like you mean it means not interrupting, but also not thinking while they're talking how you're going to respond. So how often do we do tit for tat?
Yeah.
Like, I really hate it when you come home and you just drop all your stuff at the front door. Well, what I really hate is when you put the towel at wherever. And so we're not hearing them. We're more focused on being right
Yeah.
than we are about working on the relationship.